Imagine yourself surrounded by the sights, sounds, and instincts of wildlife. For some children, this is more than just a fantasy. It's a harsh reality. Whether abandoned, lost, or orphaned, these kids found themselves depending on the most unexpected animal caregivers. From the heart of the jungle to the forests, their incredible stories are as true as they are astonishing. What would it be like to live in a world where animals become your family? Join us on a journey into the untamed world of kids who were raised by animals. Dina Sanar. Imagine being raised by wolves in the wilds of India. That's exactly what happened to Dina Sanar, a real-life wolf boy who lived a life straight out of a fairy tale. For years, he roamed the forest with his pack, thinking he was one of them. But everything changed in February 1867 when hunters found him in a cave in Uttar Pradesh, a northern region of India, and took him to the Sandra Mission orphanage. Suddenly, Dina's wild adventure took a turn, and he was thrust into the human world. At the orphanage, missionaries tried to teach Dina the basics of human life, like walking and speaking. However, bridging the gap between his wild instincts and human behavior proved incredibly challenging. Unlike the Disney version of Mowgli, Dina's story didn't end with a smooth transition into human society. At the orphanage, Dina earned the nickname Wolf Boy because his behavior was more like that of a wild animal than a human. He crawled on all fours, had trouble standing upright, and only ate raw meat and bones. Despite the orphanage's best efforts to help him adjust to human life, he struggled to learn to speak and adapt to his new environment. Throughout his life, Dina remained largely unfamiliar with human ways. He continued to struggle with adaptation, and despite the efforts to help him, he never fully blended into the human way of life. Dina lived until he was about 35 years old, passing away in 1895. Sujit Kumar the Chicken Boy. People who cared for Sujit Kumar still called him a boy, even though he was 32 years old. This Fijian man had never learned to speak and was just starting to behave like a typical adult. The reason? They say he spent his childhood locked in a chicken coop. Kumar's nightmare began when his mother took her own life right after his father was murdered. At just 6 years old, he was taken in by his grandfather, who cruelly locked him in a chicken coop. Later, Kumar was moved to the Samabula Old People's Home, where his aggressive behavior meant he had to be restrained. Elizabeth Clayton, who lost her husband, Roger Buick, a New Zealand climber on Mount Everest, became one of Kumar's caretakers. When Clayton first met Kumar, he would peck at his food and huddle down like a bird. Years of manual labor have left his fingers twisted and stiff, causing them to click rapidly when he moves them. He also appeared lost in thought, disconnected from the world around him. Thanks to a caretaker named Drauna Madavesi, Kumar now goes to school every day in a factory room in suburban Suva. Madavesi revealed that for 30 years, Kumar had done nothing at all and didn't even know how to stand or walk. Marina Chapman. In the early 1950s, Colombia was torn apart by a brutal conflict that caused millions of children to be displaced and kidnapped. Marina Chapman was just a young child when she was taken, one among many who were torn from their families during this time. She was forcibly taken from her village, a place she was too young to remember, and then left alone in the thick jungle on her own. To survive, she learned to imitate the capuchin monkeys she found there. She gathered berries and roots, scavenged for bananas left behind by the apes, and found shelter in tree hollows. She even learned to move around on all fours like her primate friends. Eventually, hunters came and took her away, but by then, she'd forgotten how to speak. Chapman's troubles didn't end there. After being rescued, she was sold to a brothel in Cucuta, but was kicked out because she was too wild. She then lived on the streets before becoming a slave to a mafia family. Fortunately, Chapman's luck came when a compassionate neighbor named Maruja intervened. Maruja arranged for Chapman to move to Bogota, where she was welcomed into the home of Maruja's daughter. Around the age of 14, Chapman was adopted by Maria. Maria's family had ties to Bradford, England, through their textile business, and in 1977, they sent Chapman to Bradford to work as a nanny for their children. Today, Chapman lives in Bradford, She married a local scientist and they have 2 daughters. Kid found among wolves. In 1976, at just 4 years old, a kid famously known as the Wolf Boy was found playing with wolf cubs in Uttar Pradesh, an Indian forest. In India, it's well known that wolves inhabit the deep ravines along rivers, which led to the theory that the boy might have been raised in an area heavily influenced by wolves, especially since bears and baboons are not found there. His appearance clearly showed signs of his wild upbringing. He had dark skin, sharp teeth, long claw-like nails, tangled hair, and hardened palms, elbows, and knees. His diet included hunting chickens and consuming soil and blood. Ramu, as he would later be called, was taken into the care of Mother Teresa's missionaries of charity. There, he learned essential life skills like personal hygiene and dressing himself, but despite their best efforts, he never acquired the ability to speak. At night, he would sneak out and steal chickens. Some experts dismissed his story as mere fiction, arguing that he was mentally impaired rather than a genuine case of a child raised by animals. Boy raised by grizzly bear. A boy was nurtured and raised by a grizzly bear, growing up in the wild far from human civilization. Although he was born to human parents, he was snatched away by a group of grizzly bears right after birth. Legend has it that children raised by grizzly bears develop unique traits. They gain extraordinary strength, sharp intellect, and a taste for fatty salmon, along with a preference for long winter naps. This boy was no exception. He learned to speak only in bear language, communicating with grunts, growls, and a distinctive, unusual sound that could be described as rather strange or even horrible. Determined to change his life, he ran 10 miles every day in preparation for the 1980 Bear Olympics. The boy also announced that once the Olympics were over, he planned to leave the bears and start living as a real human. He trained rigorously, consumed plenty of salmon guts, and eventually made his mark. The boy raised by a leopard. A 2-year-old boy from India was seized by a leopard in 1912. 3 years later, a hunter killed the leopard and discovered 3 cubs in her den, one of which was the now 5-year-old boy. The boy was returned to his family in a small Indian village, but his behavior was quite extraordinary. Initially, he moved on all 4s with surprising agility, his toes even curling upward. His hands and feet were toughened by his time in the wild, and he behaved very much like a wild animal. He attacked anyone who came near, lived off raw village chickens, and communicated only with growls. In spite of his wild behavior, the boy was incredibly fast on hands and knees, running as quickly as a grown man might run upright. Over time, he began to adapt to human ways, learning to speak and walk on 2 legs. However, tragically, he eventually lost his sight due to a hereditary condition that also affected other members of his family. Raised by goats. Social workers made a heart-wrenching discovery when they found a 2-year-old boy, known only as Sasha T., living under horrifying conditions. Sasha was found in a filthy house, confined to a room and surrounded by goats. The environment was appalling, dirty and neglected, with Sasha alone, cold and naked. Sasha had been suffering from severe malnutrition and neglect. He had never learned basic skills such as speaking, eating properly, or using the toilet. When Irina Bova, one of the social workers, arrived at the scene, she was struck by the sight of Sasha in such a weird situation. The room was in a state of decay, filled with grime and neglect. Recognizing the immediate danger to Sasha's health, the social workers quickly took him to the hospital. His severe neglect had led to significant delays in his brain development, and he weighed far less than other children his age. Additionally, he was missing fundamental skills for his age, like holding a spoon or playing with toys. 2 girls raised by she-wolves. One of the most astonishing stories about feral kids from history involves 2 girls named Amala and Kamala, who were said to have been raised by a she-wolf. The story begins in 1920 when a reverend in India came across a she-wolf with her cubs. Among the cubs were 2 that had unusual features. They looked partly human and had long, tangled hair. These girls were brought to an orphanage in Midnapore, India, where the reverend and his wife worked. The girls, Amala and Kamala, were unlike any other children. They moved around on their hands and knees, with their palms and knees rough and calloused from constant crawling. They preferred raw meat and drank liquids with their tongues, often eating while crouched down. Their thick red lips made their tongues stick out, and they exhibited wolf-like behavior, such as prowling and howling at night. Sadly, Amala passed away in 1921 from a kidney infection and was buried in St. John's Church graveyard, Midnapore. Kamala, showing signs of grief, became more approachable afterward. Despite her previous discomfort around humans, the Reverend slowly began to form a bond with Kamala. Through patience and care, he worked to soften her skin, provide proper nutrition, and show her gentle affection. His efforts gradually earned Kamala's trust and created a learning environment that helped her begin to make progress. With persistent effort, she was partially house-trained, adapted to human company, and learned to walk upright a bit, although she still often reverted to all fours for speed. After 5 years at the orphanage, Kamala began to show signs of intellectual growth and had learned a few words before she died of tuberculosis in 1929. Ivan Mishkov. In the tough streets of Moscow during the 1990s, a kid named Ivan Mishika struggled with severe poverty. He was raised by an alcoholic grandfather who frequently left him alone for days, forcing Ivan to fend for himself. Seeking comfort and security, Ivan found solace among stray dogs. Lacking a stable home and having few resources, Ivan had to quickly adapt to the challenging urban environment. He discovered that by offering food to stray dogs, he could earn their protection and warmth. For 2 years while begging for food near Moscow with his canine companions, Ivan developed deep, affectionate bonds with them, naming them Jessie, Goa, Masha, and C. However, by the age of just 4, Ivan had become the leader of this loyal pack. Meanwhile, this newfound sense of safety and belonging didn't last long. Authorities eventually intervened, using bait to lure the dogs away so they could capture them. Despite several attempts by the authorities to separate Ivan from his loyal dog family, the dogs fiercely protected him, making the rescue efforts challenging. Eventually, Ivan was rescued and placed with human caregivers at around 6 years old. Torn between his new human saviors and the dogs he considered his family, Ivan faced a heartbreaking situation. Tragically, the local officials chose to euthanize the dogs, putting an end to the lives of the loyal companions who had been Ivan's only family. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. Oxana Alexandrievna. Malaya's behavior of barking, growling, and moving around like a dog wasn't just a game. It was a survival mechanism. Born on November 4th, 1983, she gained international attention for her unusual behavior, which mimicked that of a dog. Her story has been featured in documentaries, interviews, and tabloid headlines, casting her as a feral child who was raised by dogs. Abandoned by her alcoholic parents at the tender age of 3, Oksana found refuge among stray dogs in her destitute village of Novoblovshenka in Ukraine. In search of warmth and protection, she took shelter in a dog kennel with a canine named Anita, where she lived for the next 5 years. Surrounded by a pack of dogs, Oksana gradually began to mimic their behaviors. She communicated through barking and snarling, echoing the sounds of her canine companions. Her daily life revolved around dog-like routines. She licked herself clean, ate raw meat, scavenged through trash for food, panted, and moved around on all fours. After being removed from her parents' custody, Oksana was placed in a foster home for children with mental disabilities in Barabol, a rural area in Odessa Oblast. Over the years, she received specialized therapy and education to help address her behavioral, social, and educational challenges. As she grew into adulthood, Oksana learned to control her dog-like behavior. She became fluent in speech and now works on a farm, milking cows, though she still has some intellectual impairments. Several documentaries have explored her life, including features on TV news and the Portuguese channel. Her doctors have noted that while she has made significant progress, complete rehabilitation into normal society may be unlikely. In In 2013, Oxana appeared on a Ukrainian talk show called Hovorit Ukraine. During the interview, she expressed a desire to be treated as a normal person and shared her feelings about being called a dog girl. She talked about her wish for her brothers to visit her more often and her dream of finding her biological mother. She also spoke about her relationship, her experiences in the state foster home, and her work with animals on the farm. Meanwhile, as one of the kids who were raised by animals, how do you feel about Oksana's challenges in adapting back to human life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Memi LeBlanc. In 1731, the people of a small town in southern France were amazed to discover a young girl named Marie Angelique, also known as Memi LeBlanc. She was found wearing ragged animal hides and caught red-handed stealing apples from an orchard. Determining her exact age was difficult, with guesses ranging from 10 to 18 years old. When villagers confronted her with a bulldog, she swiftly dealt a fatal blow to the dog before vanishing into the nearby woods. Eventually, she was captured, and it became clear that she did not know formal language. Instead, she communicated using animal-like sounds. Taken to a hospital in Chalon, she was baptized with the name Marie-Angélie LeBlanc. Efforts to teach her how to live in society began right away. It was discovered that she only ate raw meat, as cooked food caused her teeth to fall out. Her origins were fully revealed in 1755, with the publication of a book titled A Savage Girl, written by the biographer Marie-Catherine Omas LeBlanc. The book claimed that she was originally a Native American girl who had been captured and sold into slavery in Wisconsin at the age of 7. After surviving a shipwreck, she lived in the wild with another girl, and they sustained themselves by hunting and eating raw animals. 1-year-old boy found in Argentina. In the heart of Argentina, a miraculous story unfolded in 2008. A 1-year-old boy, abandoned and left to fate, found solace in the unlikeliest of saviors, a pack of 8 wild cats. These fierce felines became the boy's protectors and providers, ensuring his survival on the unforgiving streets of Misiones. It wasn't until the police and missionaries intervened that the boy's story came to light, revealing the bond between the child and the cats. Doctors believe that during cold nights, these cats huddled close to the boy, providing the warmth he needed to stay alive. The boy was often seen eating scraps that the cats had brought to him, while they gently licked him clean. Whenever authorities approached, the cats would hiss and act defensively, as if they knew the boy was vulnerable and needed their protection. Reports suggested that the cats seemed to instinctively guard the boy as if he were their own. Authorities eventually found the boy's homeless father, who revealed that he had lost sight of his son while gathering cardboard to sell just a few days earlier. Marcos Rodriguez. Between the ages of 7 and 19, Marcos Rodriguez led a life that most of us would find unimaginable. Abandoned as a young boy in 1953, he was left to survive alone in the rugged and desolate Sierra Morena mountains of southern Spain. In this harsh environment, far from any sign of human civilization, Marcos was forced to fend for himself. With no one else around, he turned to the wolves that roamed the area for companionship and protection. Over time, these wolves became his new family, offering him the comfort and security he desperately needed. In their company, Marcos lost his ability to speak and began to communicate in the only way he knew, barking, screaming, and howling, much like the animals he lived with. 12 years later, in a twist of fate, the police found Marcos hidden away in the mountains. Dressed in deerskins and with his hair wild and untamed, he was a living relic of his years in the wild. Despite his attempts to avoid capture, he was eventually apprehended, his hands bound and taken to the nearest village. Fortunately, a compassionate young priest intervened and arranged for Marcos to be transferred to a hospital wing at a monastery in Madrid. There, under the care of nuns, he began to receive education and support. However, reintegrating into the human world proved to be incredibly challenging for Marcos. Over the next 50 years, he drifted through various places, monasteries, rundown buildings, and hostels, while taking on various jobs in construction, bars, nightclubs, and hotels. His trusting nature made him vulnerable, and he often fell victim to abuse and theft. Despite the occasional kindness from others, Marcos struggled to fit in and navigate the complexities of human interactions. His life was a continuous battle to adapt to a world that seemed so different from the one he had known in the wilderness. John Esabunya. At just 2 to 3 years old, John Esabunya's story begins with profound tragedy and survival against all odds. His life hit rock bottom when his father's rage turned deadly, claiming his mother's life. In the chaos that followed, little John fled into the jungle, driven by fear for his own life. For the next 8 to 12 months, John survived alone in the wild, relying solely on his instincts and whatever scant resources nature provided. His memories of those early days are hazy, but he does remember the initial encounters with monkeys. These creatures, cautious at first, slowly began to approach him, bringing gifts like carrots, nuts, sweet potatoes, and cassava. Over time, John became a part of their group, learning crucial survival skills from them, how to find food and navigate through the thick jungle foliage. During a civil war ravaging the region, very few people dared to venture into the isolated jungle where John was living. It was months before Millie, a resident, stumbled upon him among the monkeys. John was brought to Millie's village, where the signs of his feral upbringing were immediately obvious. His body was covered in a thick layer of dirt, a telltale sign of a life lived in the wild. His knees were marked and nearly white from constant crawling, while his nails had grown long and curved. John had yet to develop any of the habits or behaviors typical of life among people. Victor of Aviron. Victor of Aviron was a mysterious and captivating figure from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Discovered in the woods of France in 1798, Victor was around 9 years old and had lived most of his life in the wild. His story became one of the most famous and thoroughly studied cases of feral children, the rare and intriguing phenomenon where a child is raised outside human society. When Victor was first found, he was caught multiple times because he kept running back into the woods, escaping from people trying to bring him to civilization. Soon after Victor's rediscovery, he was promptly evaluated by Pierre Joseph, a local authority figure and biology professor, who examined to assess his condition. Pierre stripped Victor of his clothes and took him outside into the snow. Instead of reacting with distress, Victor began to play in the cold, revealing that he was used to such exposure. This behavior impressed Pierre and suggested that Victor was accustomed to living in harsh conditions. The local government commissioner, Constance Saint-Estève, also observed Victor and noted that his behavior was scary, making him appear almost like a wild animal. Later, Victor was transported to Rodez, where he was visited by 2 men who had suffered the loss of their sons during the French Revolution. The men had hoped to find a long-lost family connection. However, neither of them recognized Victor as their missing child. There were various rumors about Victor's origins. One rumor suggested he was the illegitimate son of a notaire who had been abandoned due to his muteness. The case of Victor caught the attention of Jean Itard, a young and dedicated physician. He figured Victor had spent about 7 years alone in the wild, starting around age 4 or 5 and lasting until he was 12. So Jean decided to step in and help Victor. For 5 years, Jean worked tirelessly with Victor, attempting to teach him to speak and understand the world around him. His innovative methods and meticulous records of Victor's progress not only aimed to educate the boy, but also paved the way for new approaches to working with individuals who faced developmental challenges. Although it was evident that Victor could hear, he was brought to the National Institute of the Deaf in Paris to be studied by the renowned Roche-Ambroise Sicard. Sicard and other members of the Society of Observers of Man hoped that by studying and educating Victor, they could gather evidence to support the empiricist theory of knowledge, which was becoming increasingly popular during the Age of Enlightenment. This theory focused on understanding what separated humans from animals, with a key factor being the ability to learn language. Through their study of Victor, they aimed to shed light on the relationship between humans and society. During the Enlightenment, many thinkers, including naturalists and philosophers, started to view human nature in a new way. With the changes brought by the French Revolution and new scientific and philosophical ideas, people began to see humans as just another part of nature rather than something special. Studying Victor was intended to support this new way of thinking. As a result, Victor became a key example in the Enlightenment debate about what makes humans different from animals. Peter, the Wild Boy. In 1725, a boy known as Peter the Wild Boy was found alone without clothes in the dense German wilderness. At the time of his rescue, Peter was about 11 years old. A year later, around the age of 12, he was brought to London, where he caught the attention of King George. Peter became something of a curiosity at the royal court, behaving in ways that were more animal than human. He would run on all fours and occasionally swipe items from the pockets of the courtiers. This led to his nickname, Wild Boy. Despite the initial fascination with his wild behaviors, Peter's antics eventually became too disruptive for the palace. As a result, he was moved to a farm in Hertfordshire, where he lived out his remaining years under the care of kind-hearted farmers. He wore a collar that read, Peter, the Wild Man of Hanover, as a constant reminder of his extraordinary past. When Peter passed away in 1785, he was buried in the cemetery of St. Mary's in North Church. Later examinations of portraits of Peter suggest he might have had Pitt-Hopkins syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that causes distinctive facial features and intellectual disabilities. This condition could explain why Peter's parents might have abandoned him. Roacho Cambodian, the Jungle Girl. In January 2007, a mysterious woman emerged from the dense Cambodian jungle in Ratnakiri province, startling locals and sparking international intrigue. Covered in dirt, naked and bearing numerous scars, she was quickly given the nickname Cambodian Jungle Girl. A nearby family recognized the woman as their daughter, Roacho Cambodian, who had been missing for nearly 20 years. They believed she had been living in the jungle, fending for herself, and had suddenly re-emerged in an unfamiliar state. However, not everyone bought the wild child story. Some reporters suspected she might be a different woman who had been held captive. The situation grew more complex when a Vietnamese man stepped forward, claiming that the woman was his daughter who had gone missing in 2006. However, a local villager reported that he had noticed food disappearing from his lunchbox and had seen Roacho Cambodian in the jungle. There were also reports of a naked man seen with her who disappeared when approached. Some villagers believed he might have been a jungle spirit. Sao Lu, a village policeman and father from the Nong ethnic minority, believed the woman was his daughter who had been lost in the jungle in 1988 while tending buffalo. He recognized her by a scar and her resemblance to her mother, though DNA tests never happened because the family later refused. A reporter noted the woman's scars suggested she might have been held captive rather than living freely in the jungle. The marks on her arms and her ability to use a spoon without instruction led to speculation she might have been a victim of abuse. Human rights organizations echoed this concern, suggesting she had suffered some form of torture. Initially struggling to adapt to regular life, this woman showed signs of basic communication and understanding, but still preferred crawling and had difficulty adjusting to clothes. The Cambodian family who took her in watched her closely, fearing she might flee back to the jungle. The situation drew global attention and left many questions unanswered about her true story. Hanny Istok. On March 17, 1749, two fishermen, Maggie and Monar, made an amazing find while out fishing. They discovered a mysterious boy, about 8 to 10 years of age. The boy, later named Hanny, appeared entirely human, yet his behavior was animal-like, leaving the discoverers bewildered. The fishermen took him to an estate where he was temporarily baptized. Hanny was eventually placed under the care of the estate steward. At first, he survived on a diet of grass, hay, and straw, and he was extremely fearful of people. Whenever he felt scared, he naturally ran to the water for safety. Even though he didn't like staying on land, he was an amazing swimmer and skilled at catching fish. It took a full year for Hanny to adjust to eating cooked food and wearing clothes. Over time, he began to resemble a typical human, and the locals gradually grew to trust him. However, Hanny took the chance to escape. Even though he was spotted from time to time, he always found a way to hide underwater. As time passed, stories about Hanny grew into local legends. Many folktales portrayed him as a creature that was half fish and half human, living in a nearby lake. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.